Parking situation. Okay, we're ready. Here we go. Good evening, everyone. It's now 5 o'clock, and I'll call to order the workshop of the Victoria City Council. Our workshops are informal, and with that, we'll dive right into our agenda. There are 2 items on the agenda this evening. Our first item is a discussion about our downtown parking ordinance. Presenting this evening is our Community and Economic Development Director, Marty Dahl. Mr. Dahl, the floor is yours.
Good evening, Mayor, members of the council. Thank you. Yes, we are here to re-engage in a discussion on downtown parking here in Victoria. As you may recall, this is an item that's been on the Planning Commission's work plan for a couple of years. We've had some previous discussion, had some starts and stops with other priorities popping up, but we wanted to have a discussion with the City Council in a workshop format and see if we can get some initial feedback and direction on how we want to move forward with continued discussions for downtown parking. So just as a little bit of background, in 2018, the Hoisington Kogler Group, HKGI, conducted a downtown parking study for the city that included doing some parking count utilization, different times of year, different days of the week, as well as pulling all that data together and providing some recommendations. That study was finalized and adopted by the council in February of 2019. The primary objectives of that study at the time were collecting and assessing utilization counts for downtown Victoria to better understand existing parking needs and issues, developing a parking tool to help assess downtown Victoria's redevelopment assumptions and their impacts on the parking supply, as well as establishing strategies and recommendations that support a district-wide parking approach while fostering economic development initiatives. So utilization counts as part of that study, as I mentioned, were gathered, and those counts did indicate that there is additional capacity for district-wide parking. Again, keep in mind this was a 2018 study, so the data is a little bit old, but it's specifically during the morning and afternoon hours, and that heavy demand during the evening hours is creating a parking convenience issue, but not necessarily a capacity issue on the dates that were studied. So in general, it did indicate that if you were to look at downtown as an entire district, there is parking capacity available, although it's starting to get squeezed in the evening hours.
Marty, can you go back to that chart and just explain to us, on street, is that, okay, so on street there were 84 that were used, off street were 147 that were used?
Yeah, so this was just a snippet from the table. The full table within the study provides a little bit better context. But yes, I believe that was the, this was the supply. So what's being shown there was the supply that was available at those different points in time.
Okay, so this is what was left after the...
Correct, yep.
And this was in 2018?
This was 2018 was when the counts were taken, correct.
No other counts have been...
We have not done any updated counts since 2018, that's correct.
So this is what was taken at the time. It doesn't say how many were available.
No, this is what...
This is what was available during the October utilization count. So again, this was just a snippet for the PowerPoint slide. There were several other tables. There was some different counts taken earlier in the year. There were some counts taken, I believe, in the winter months. And then that data from the different times of year was all compiled into the recommendations and the total capacity. They were done.
So just so you know, this was before Winchester and Rye was open?
It was before Winchester and Rye was open. It was also prior to the parking spaces on Steiger Lake Lane being put into place. So there's some new assumptions new analysis that will need to take place as any direction that we want to take with downtown parking, because we do have a new use that will need to check utilization. We've got some new spaces available. There had been an intention to try and do some updated counts in 2020, but we all know what happened in 2020, which would not have given us very good data if we would have tried to do that then. And even this year, I think numbers are probably still artificially low based on the COVID situation. So we are waiting for an opportunity to get some updated counts when it makes sense.
Thank you.
So currently, our downtown parking requirements are governed by a specific section of the zoning code, section 20-7, which outlines the requirements for central business district. This does allow for up to a 50% reduction in parking minimum. So if you look at the code section, it will give a use, it will give the minimum parking spaces that are required for that use, and in the CBD, that calculation can be divided by up to half to be able to get the minimum parking spaces that would be required for a new use or change of use downtown. The number of spaces is for all zoning districts, but again, unique to the CBD is that minimum can be reduced by up to 50%. Right now, there are challenges with that. It's sometimes difficult to determine and calculate how exactly the shared parking that's available can and should be incorporated into those minimum parking requirements for developments, expansions, or more frequently change of use. That's what we've seen the last couple of years. We've seen some uses change, and how do you calculate the existing parking that was allocated and what portion of that was shared, and what happens when that use changes, and what happens then if that use were to change again. So those are the conversations we have with folks when we're talking about parking downtown currently. And then there are also some concerns over the total parking capacity in downtown and what impacts any new development might have. We know there are a few parcels remaining downtown that are ready or ripe for redevelopment that will create new uses that would have impacts on that total downtown parking capacity. So that's the situation we are in currently when we're reviewing parking for downtown uses. So last year we did re-engage with HKGI to do just a mini phase 2 of their parking study. They had some recommendations that were included as part of the initial study. Some of those were looked into early on. Some were implemented, like the downtown parking signs. Some things like valet parking were tried and determined not to really work well. But one of the other recommendations of that study was to look at updating the city's downtown parking ordinance and provide some additional information to that. So we did engage HKGI again last year on a very small scope project based on that portion of the parking study, and their scope at that point in time was to provide some draft language using their expertise and best practices that would embrace a shared parking model to maximize these underutilized spaces that we currently have in downtown. To establish zoning district specific parking minimum maximum recommendations. So rather than using our old all zoning district wide parking minimum maximums, let's create a specific minimum and maximum for uses in the downtown, again using best practices in other areas where that information is available. Refine the parking generation model that was developed as part of the 2018 downtown parking study to incorporate these new proposed minimums and maximums. What that parking generation model is actually an Excel spreadsheet tool that uses all of the available parking, the different times of day as the background data, and then you're able to, we as staff in a spreadsheet are able to enter in a new use and how big it is, how many units, if it's residential, how large, if it's commercial. That will pull the data as to the minimum and maximum parking spaces that should be required, and then it will do the automatic calculations. And I'll show just a snippet example here in a couple of slides, but it's a pretty neat tool to be able to really easily see what those impacts are different times of day with different uses based on that parking data. Oh, and then sorry, the last bullet, that we also asked them to provide some recommendations to better accommodate curbside parking. Again, this was in the heart of the pandemic in 2020 when we were having these conversations when curbside and pickup really became a more necessary use for many of our businesses downtown. So it was very much a topic of focus. So included in your background packet was some, again, this is very, very early draft ordinance language that HKGI provided and staff looked at and massaged a little bit. That could provide a potential direction for an update to the city's downtown parking ordinance language. I think what staff would be trying to accomplish, if the council agrees with the direction, is to better be able to work with what we have today, understanding that we want to add additional parking as development happens downtown or redevelopment happens downtown, but to really think about how we can better utilize, based on some updated language in these shared parking in our real life use, how can we better utilize our parking ordinance for uses today. So with that in mind, this draft ordinance language does include updated parking minimum maximums specific to the CBD. It would allow for shared parking agreements between private parties to meet those parking minimums. That's something that is allowed today as well. It would allow development, expansion, or change of use to utilize a percentage of that available shared parking, with that percentage, maximum percentage, to be determined. Within, again, in the ordinance, the placeholder is 1,000 feet. That could change to meet minimum parking requirements. Yes?
It was 500. Why did we go to 1,000?
I think the idea behind 1,000, especially in this early draft ordinance, is that the underutilized parking is farther than 500 feet away from some of the core businesses. So that's the parking that we're really trying to encourage people to
So
utilize.
you do realize 1,000 feet's like 3 football fields.
Yeah, 1,000 feet would get you potentially from Steiger Lake Lane to the other end. So I think that we're the idea, again, and this is something that's up for the council and the planning commission, and we're planning on engaging stakeholders downtown. But the idea is that, again, trying to better utilize the underutilized parking, which you would need to be able to incorporate some of those farther out spaces to be able to do.
Judy, you good for now?
For now, but no.
I have a quick question too. In terms of the allowed shared parking agreements between private parties to meet the parking minimum, how does that work? What is that?
So an example would be if you had a private parking lot that was owned by a bank, and their primary use is during the day. They close at 5 o'clock, and they want to enter an agreement that a restaurant that has primary use after their closing hours, they see their biggest parking demand after 5 o'clock. That they'd be able to share those parking spaces, because the one use has that demand during the day, the other use has that demand in the evening. So while they may not in that lot have the maximum amount of or minimum amount of parking spaces, if you were to treat both of those businesses separately by use, because their use times are different, they can both utilize those spaces.
Yeah, they did that with the borough and the businesses that face his parking lot. They have an agreement.
Okay.
So that they can use, I think, up until 4, and then the borough takes over.
Okay.
And that's where these actual utilization counts help. It helps staff, it helps the council be able to make those determinations, where you can look at it and see when their peak use is going to be, how many spaces are available during those peak uses. So having that data and getting eventually that updated data will be helpful in those types of situations. So where was I at here? Available public spaces would be determined using those adopted utilization counts, and then calculated using that parking generation model, with those utilization counts to be completed and updated periodically. So again, for example, if we were to plug in a new restaurant use, and you calculate how many minimum and maximum parking spaces that use needs, and it's blowing away all of your available shared parking at one or multiple given times during the day, that tells staff, that tells the council that parking needs to be added as part of that development or redevelopment, because you're blowing away your shared parking in those times, and you don't have the capacity any longer to be able to accommodate that with shared parking. A conditional use permit would be required to reduce parking requirements and use shared parking. So again, that gives the planning commission and the council another opportunity in the process to review these things and look at other factors as well. So if that use is not going to provide the minimum amount of parking on space and are going to utilize a shared parking model for a percentage of that, council will have to look at that, planning commission will have to look at that, staff will have to look at that, and we'll help make those determinations as to whether that's adequate or not. And then there would be a required payment of shortage any shortage to a parking fund. I think that would be something that would need to be hashed out a little further to determine what that, if that's a payment per space or if it's something else. But essentially that if you're not providing those private spaces and you're using the shared spaces, there should be some sort of compensation into a parking fund to maintain and keep those spaces and add new spaces.
Would this be like a yearly payment, or is it a one-time payment?
You know, I think that's open to discussion, and I know this has been used. It's currently in the current code. Language is a little different, and it's been a one-time payment, which I think makes sense. Is that you determine what that cost would be at a one-time fee, but I think there's flexibility there. And again, it's something that can be talked about of whether or not it should even be included at all.
Okay.
And then also includes some placeholder information, not a lot of detail yet at this time on trying to provide some time restricted parking for curbside or pickup. So that's just kind of an overview of where the current language on the again, very, very, very early draft is located. This document was included in your background packet. It's a little hard to see on the screen, but this essentially is the revised parking minimum and maximum regulations. As was noted in your background packet, it was developed by HKGI based on industry standards, precedent examples, and best practices. If you were to compare this to our existing parking minimum and maximums with the 50% reduction, you would find that they're relatively close. I do not have a current side-by-side comparison, but as we move forward, or if we move forward in this process, we certainly can provide that. But this would essentially generate what that the minimum number of spaces as well as a maximum amount of spaces. And the reason for including a maximum, which isn't included now, is because you don't necessarily want to overpark your downtown either. You don't want to take valuable downtown real estate that might have a higher or better use and turn that into parking. So that's the reason behind having both a minimum and maximum parking for these uses. This is just a snippet of that parking demand model tool that I mentioned. So again, in real life, this is a spreadsheet. So it includes an available supply of parking, weekday and weekend, different times, saying what is there for your public parking. And then when you go down into that spreadsheet, you're able to add a new land use. So for just purposes of this example, I put in a 2,000 square foot restaurant that shows that you would be required a minimum of 20 spaces and a maximum of 31. And then that will calculate within here and tell you how many spaces are available. So you'll see on the weekends at 6 o'clock with that using all shared parking. If there were to be no parking added, you'd be below your capacity for weekend evening times, which we know is a peak time for restaurants. So again, I think that helps inform decisions when you're looking at how much shared parking can be allowed. I didn't include step 2, but step 2 includes parking added. So if the development were to say we're proposing we're going to do 15 parking spaces, you're able to add that in and it will calculate. And then this assumes that this was a change of use, so you're discontinuing, just for purposes of an example, an office or medical clinics which had much smaller parking requirements, but that factors that into the calculation as well when it determines what the available parking is in the shared district. So this would, again, assuming we were to move forward with something like this shared parking model, this would be a tool that would be important for staff on the very front end when new development and redevelopment is being proposed, to try and start calculating the impacts parking would have downtown.
Marty, did you put our current conditions into a tool and find out what it spit out the other side?
So our current conditions, we have not put in our current conditions every land use and tried to see what that generates. But what we're using as the available supply is that actual real world utilization. So that's where the supply is coming from. So the supply is saying in our real world counts, we have this many spaces available. And that's how we know that or at least again in 2018 when these counts were done, is that there is capacity available during these peak times. But no, we have not actually done a generation based on minimum and maximums of current uses to see what that actually spits out.
I would be curious to see where we sit currently with the way our downtown is now. You can find out where we are now and with the current land uses where we would be.
And it would be an interesting exercise. It would be a little bit of a manual process to try and determine every single use, but it would also be interested to see if the current businesses are actually in line with those minimum maximums, right? In theory, if one were to plug in our current businesses into a tool and see the uses, we should see the available supply that we're seeing here if they're close to in line with what we're denoting as what minimum and maximum parking should be for these different types of uses. You should be pretty close to what your available supply is once you've factored in every use in downtown, but we have not done that exercise. So we also did have this discussion last winter. Actually, I think it was our last December meeting of the year in 2020 with Planning Commission, just to kind of get this information out, to get their gears turning as well. So we did have some Planning Commission feedback from that meeting. Much of that discussion centered around, kind of reverting back to the conversations that were had when the 2018 study was conducted and the need for providing more convenient or nearby parking for shops and restaurants. So that's obviously still a part of this conversation, but not necessarily directly related to the ordinance language that we're talking about today. And there has been a continued desire for a new parking structure lot somewhere downtown. Staff did indicate that we believe that at least currently the current makeup is that any additional parking would likely be dependent or concurrent with any new private development downtown, and that this proposed ordinance update is meant to better help utilize parking in its current capacity. There were concerns to Councilmember Black's point about the shared parking being allowed to count toward a use's parking requirements up to 1,000 feet away. There was a note that if a parking fund is to be used, it needs to be very specific as to how those funds will help improve downtown parking conditions, so that folks that are paying into that parking fund are able to know what that money is being used for. The Planning Commission was generally supportive of the updated parking minimum and maximum regulations that were provided for the CBD. Noted that it's important to bring the key stakeholders, such as downtown businesses, to the table for future discussions. There was a request that the city's proposed downtown west, while they'd like to see it abide by similar restrictions or the same restrictions as CBD parking requirements, that it should be self-supporting for parking, so not combine the two when you're looking at a shared parking district. And then they did determine that time restrictions for curbside pickup would be beneficial, but would be difficult to enforce with things such as signage, or meters, or things you need people actually out enforcing those pieces. So again, Mayor, members of the council, this is really meant to just be kind of a kickoff to this discussion and try to get some feedback and direction on how you'd like staff to proceed on this topic in general. Looking for initial feedbacks on if or how you'd like us to continue working on downtown parking, any overall thoughts on the direction of an ordinance and trying to better utilize that shared parking model, or things we should be looking at or doing differently or not looking at all. And then I think our anticipated next steps would be based on your feedback and direction. We'll continue discussions with the Planning Commission and keep moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Dahl. Council, questions for Mr. Dahl? Thoughts? Councilmember Hebert.
A quick question. It said, I think the Planning Commission recommended that we the city would meet with the current business owners. Did that happen?
We have not had that conversation. We wanted to have this conversation with the city council first, and this last meeting with Planning Commission in December and this meeting now being in September, you'll see we got a little sidetracked with other items, so it's been a little slower, but we wanted to have this meeting first, get council's direction, make sure we're all on the same page before we start moving forward and having some additional conversations or surveying some of our businesses.
Councilmember Black, go ahead.
Yes, I went over the chart that you had set up, and I saw in a couple of the instances you had included a space for each employee, if I'm not mistaken. shouldn't that be reflected in all these businesses? For instance, like a hair salon could have, 20 employees. So how many chairs are in there? And how many spaces are they going to need? Where are the employees going to park? Is this included, or is that it just seems to me by changing from 500 to 1,000, what you've done is you just expanded your area so that you can say you're accommodating parking.
Yeah, Councilmember Black, Mayor, members of the council, that's a very good question, something that I will follow up with HKGI on, and whether or not employees were factored into the square footage counts, or if that's something that we should make sure that we're
The first
putting in
time,
directly.
my very first meeting, I think that they were here, and I was brand new, and I looked at their report. They didn't include employees, so I was a little taken aback on that. The other thing I noted was that for single-family homes, they're not including any enclosed parking.
Yeah, let me just find where that is at here.
Or multifamily, or senior citizen housing, or townhouses. They're just not, so they're just going to park in the driveway?
Yeah, that's a good question. Or is this in addition to what is included, because the apartment building?
No, so
this is
Councilmember Black,
proposed.
Mayor, members of the council, this would be the minimum and maximum total parking spaces available. Now, I think if the council wants to ensure that a portion of that parking is enclosed, I think that's something that we would want to add to the ordinance as well. I think in a multifamily situation, you sometimes see they have underground parking as well as surface lot parking. So I think we'd have to determine what that right number or mix or percentage would be. But certainly if the council were to want to require that there be some sort of covered or enclosed parking for any of these residential or other uses, it'd be something we'd want to add into these parking minimums and maximums.
Yeah,
Yeah, for sure, I agree.
it's like,
Yeah, you have
I
to,
looked at this and I'm like, what? What is going on? And then one space for 4 seats in the church or synagogue or two, and then when we get into restaurants, 18 spaces per 1,000. How do you even figure that? Don't you figure how many tables and how many seats?
Commissioner Black, or Commissioner, I'm sorry, I'm used to the planning commission.
I got
Council member Black, Mayor, members of the council. The actual best practices for how much parking should be provided for a specific use is certainly not my expertise. So I've relied on our consultants to provide this data, which again, as I noted, they've indicated has been provided through their experience working on these things, best practices in urban settings, et cetera. So I can't speak specifically to how those calculations are determined, other than I've relying on the expertise of our consultants to provide that information, but I'm certainly happy to take any questions such as that back to them and either A, have them relook at it, or B, ask for how they're calculating those numbers and getting to that rationale.
yeah, I'm sure there's.
That's a big question. It's like, how did they come up with this? And how did they determine this? I just see it creating more problems. And just to expand our parking area from 500 to 1,000 feet is, to me, just putting a Band-Aid on it. People are not going to walk 3 football fields to come to a restaurant. They're just not going to do it. They're going to drive around, they'll go a couple of blocks, and then they're going to go somewhere else. So I don't see this as an answer, to be honest.
I think, as I look at the data here, right, I wonder if they're looking at it because restaurants turn over from time to time. And if the square footage essentially stays the same, but the format in terms of how many tables, how this, the shell remains the same, but it could be different when it turns over. So maybe they have to have some sort of model
Right.
to kind of, as a starting point.
We need to know how many tables, how many people they're gonna sit.
Because, I mean, if the restaurant is a different restaurant tomorrow, that's a completely different layout, right? Then that kind of throws that, so
Right, so
my
you
guess
just can't say 1,000 or 2,000 feet. You just can't say that because you don't know how many tables they've got in there, how many people they're going to be providing service to, how many service workers are gonna be there.
Well, but the thing is you don't build parking every time you get a new business. I mean, it's not, you have to have something sort of consistent that's gonna generally meet your needs, because you don't, I mean, you can, you have built-in parking. So, for instance, if we use the School of the Wise example, we don't know if there's gonna be more or less employees there. We don't know if they're gonna stay longer or shorter than the restaurant before it. We don't know if they're gonna have seating inside or if it's gonna be a pick up and go. So I think, you know, from a policy standpoint, you really wanna keep it pretty general. And that's, I think, where the expertise of the consultant comes in to say, this is what we found to work in other places. And I don't know that I disagree with you on the 1,000 feet, especially in a Minnesota winter. I think that's,
Right.
that's a
Unless
tougher.
you're gonna put tubes.
That's a tougher,
yeah.
that's a tougher,
And we do know how many, he has to have 75 in order to keep his liquor license. He has to have 75 seating at his restaurant.
okay.
But I do agree with you, Judy, in terms of we should understand the methodology behind it, right? I kind of understand why they would have a model to start with, but let's understand the reasoning behind the model, and then if we still aren't certain, then we cross that bridge at that time.
I kind of like I've always been kind of a fan of the shared parking model because it utilizes the parking spaces you have without overbuilding parking. And I think we're all interested in not overbuilding
Right.
parking. And I'd like to better understand why they are feeling a need to kind of go away from that shared parking modeling, or if this is just maybe 2.0 of shared parking.
Yeah, Mayor, members of the council, I think this really is geared to try to maximize the shared parking. As I mentioned, it has some slightly lower requirements. Again, although I'm hearing that we don't like 1,000 feet, which is that's fine too, but it's trying to expand where you can pull your shared parking from when trying to hit your minimum maximums. So it is, and it's built in with a percentage to be determined, that a percentage of the shared parking can be used by a change of use or development or redevelopment to meet their parking minimums. So I think your assessment that this would be a shared parking 2.0 is probably accurate. It really is trying to best utilize that shared parking. But again, we run into the issues of convenience, proximity, that even though we know we have capacity farther out, shared parking may or may not address the needs of our specific community.
Well, and I think, you know, even since the time that we've done this parking study, things have changed. I mean, there's a lot of different things here that weren't here in 2018, and I think that bears some attention as well. I think we should take maybe another look at where we sit. I mean, how that.
I mean, I would just say, it's hard, right? Because I think we're balancing convenience versus more parking, right? And I get with the 1,000 feet, right? We have Minnesota winters and stuff, but you know, people go other places, right? Whether it's downtown and you have to park in a parking garage and you're walking somewhere. People will go places if they like the places to walk. I don't know how many times in winter or raining, drop my family off at the door and I'm the one, right? Like, I mean, there are options, you know, so I'm not necessarily against the 1,000, upping to the 1,000. Because like I said, it's either convenience or it's more options, right? Like you can't have both. We just don't have the space down here unless we want to build a parking garage, which I don't think, you know, is a feasible option, right? So I think we have to look at like it's really convenience versus more options, and you might be a little bit more inconvenienced to walk a little bit farther, but if you want more options, you might have to walk a little bit farther.
Yeah, I'm Councilmember Gunderson.
Go ahead. Maybe you'll answer it.
I'm almost tempted to pause and just wait and see where we are. You know, we're in transition downtown right now, actually, and you know, we're coming out of a pandemic. We're going to figure out what the world looks like after that once things get back to some sort of normal, whether that's the previous normal or a new normal. And so my instinct is actually to just pause and find out where we shake out in the next year or so. And I think the conversation with our business owners is an important one, and what I would encourage them to do is, as they're talking with their clientele, what are they hearing? What are their customers and clients telling them? You know, we obviously aren't going to be able to build more parking spots in front of everybody's door, but it would be interesting if we could, you know, if that conversation came up with your clientele, what does that look like? You know, how far are you willing to walk? Yeah. What's a deal breaker for you?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So have we looked at other, you know, we're obviously not the only community that has parking issues, right? Like, have we looked at, you know, some of those areas that are, you know, boxed in by a lake, or, you know, they have parking issues, like, do they have the 1,000-foot, you know,
Made their parking.
Yes. You know, so like, I guess I'm just curious if we've looked at other communities and seen if they've thought out of the box of how to fix these type of things.
Yeah, Councilmember Roberts, Mayor, members of the council, we've certainly taken a look at some comparable areas, some suburban areas that have a active or condensed downtown. You know, I think with looking at this as an urban area, we've certainly also looked at some of the, you know, even downtown Minneapolis. Obviously, this is not downtown in Minneapolis, but, you know, with the urban parking and walkability. But we've not taken a deep dive into comparables. Again, I think that was based on the feedback or direction of this meeting. If we wanted to start doing some of that deep dive, those were kind of the things we were envisioning were going to be the next steps as we move forward and looking into this.
I would like more of a deep dive when the time comes, because, you know, I've talked to people like Excelsior. You know, I've talked to people there, and their businesses, they have a large turnover because they can't accommodate the parking there, and they have a lot more parking than we do. Wayzata ended up building, you know, a big parking structure to alleviate some of that.
We would have to really understand if that was why businesses were turning over.
Well, that's what they were saying.
Parking, or if it's Councilmember Gunderson.
This is, I don't know how many more parking studies I can sit through and actually have to digest. I don't know how many more options can be presented, because since 2014, I've sat through, I don't know how many parking, and we have to have every option available to us going back 7 years. It's going to cost us money, and it's going to take time to construct, so it's going to cause headaches downtown to construct whatever option we decide to go with. Waiting is just going to cause businesses to give us the same feedback. We need more parking. It's just, at some point we either need to pull the trigger or just tell them, this is the parking we have and this is the parking we're going to deal with. Those are the options that I'm concerned that we have. Because 7-8 years in 2022 of sitting and listening to, we got to do another study. How many studies can we do? Right. I mean, how many? Without having to go back and look. We're growing. We're going to continue to bring people downtown that are in the community. I also have issues. Our businesses are great. I like them. There are businesses that are in town that aren't open at appropriate times for their business model. And that's my personal opinion, because they're not capturing the people that are coming downtown. They would do better if they were open later and were open when people were here. That's the nature of business. You capture the people. If you want people to come, it's not a parking problem for some of these businesses. It's not. And they'll probably get mad at me for saying this, but it's not. It's an immediate parking problem. You can't park right outside the business. Our capacities for the businesses, we know what every building can hold at capacity. We know that. So these studies take a portion of the capacity and mark it and go that way. That's what I've been told since 2014. We take a percentage of the capacity that each building has, and that's how many parking spots you get, at least in a couple of those. We have buildings that, if we expand this 1,000 feet, I'm assuming then all of a sudden the businesses out on 5 become part of our downtown district. Would that be accurate? Is that they're about a?
Those are private parking.
I understand, but then
That's
they.
what I didn't understand.
But that's what I'm saying. So would those businesses become part of the shared parking, and then now we've got the city has to plow and do everything there, including at the gas station and Cabin Fever and some of those in the bank, and then whatever the Brown building is.
Yeah, Commissioner Gunderson, Mayor, members of the commission, for purposes of this discussion, we were only looking at the public parking. So we were not incorporating any of the private parking lots when we're looking at capacity. So I don't think that this would necessarily envision that a private lot would become a public lot or be part of the shared parking. I think more so it would be, the question would be if Subway all of a sudden decided to change its use, would Subway be considered part of this downtown shared parking district? And then with that new use, are they able to use shared parking available? I think we would all agree that in the current situation, no, that wouldn't make sense because there's not an easy way to walk or proximity to that parking. But it would not be a case of the private lot becoming a public shared lot in those areas.
People would, if we make it notice that we are going 1,000 feet out in any direction. I mean, all of a sudden, I think you're at Lions Park from 5, and I think you're down towards Enki. And those are the only 2 directions you can go. Because I don't know if anybody. I mean, maybe Office fans might find their way into the lake, but GPS. I don't know. You got to be an office.
People are going into the condos down there.
But I mean, honestly, I walk farther in a Costco parking lot than I do anywhere in downtown Victoria if I want to park. I mean, if parking is so bad, and I think it's going to be bad, I'll just walk from home. I mean, I live close enough, and I do that. But I just think any more studies or any more delays without actually coming into some kind of, hey, we're growing and it's going to cost us money to go and do this, or we're just going to put our options up, and then when we have the money, we pick one and we go with it.
The other thing I think it's important to note is our downtown west is hopefully going to be doing something here pretty soon, and that also gets to be part of our solution. So I am certainly not in favor of running out and building a parking ramp at this point in time. I don't see a need for it. And I would actually just favor a pause, and I would be curious from my colleagues if there's anything further you'd like the staff to gather information on, or how to go forward from here. Councilmember Avery.
I thought downtown, I thought I heard someone say that downtown west from a parking perspective would be independent, right? They would be.
Are you including that as your total in 1,000 feet?
So the Planning Commission's recommendation was that the downtown west should be included or should be treated separately, so that it would have the similar restrictions. Whatever we decide for parking downtown is the same in downtown west, but that you weren't necessarily sharing capacity. Now, I think there's obviously a line there, right? I think with downtown west development, there's going to be parking added to Steiger Lake Lane, so you're going to be able to incorporate some of that parking into each of the areas. But I think the idea was that business or development in downtown west shouldn't be able to pull from available shared parking in the core downtown to meet its minimums, I think is what the direction is saying.
And vice versa.
All right.
I would agree with Derek that I don't think we need any more studies. No. I mean, but I don't think, in my opinion, it doesn't hurt to have staff look at some of those, similar communities and see if there's any out of the box thinking that they've done. Unless it's out there that, you said since 2014. I mean, I haven't necessarily seen all that stuff. So, but, if there's any other out of the box thinking that, I know there's other options down here, but, I mean, obviously no no more money spent on a study.
Yeah, I was a little disappointed in the study, to be honest.
I mean, it's just, parking, it's annoying.
But it is what it is.
It is what it is. So until we decide we're gonna, like I said, put the money towards actually a solution versus the studies. I mean, we could have had a solution with all the money we've spent on studies.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a little facetious, but not outside the ballpark. I mean, we spent a ton of money on studies. We need to find a solution. We need to pick one, and we need to say, this is what it's gonna cost you. And not just our taxpayers that live in the community, but our businesses. Because if they want more parking, it's gonna have to cost the businesses at some point, because it can't all be put on the taxpayers. We're already hemorrhaging money to them or from them because we don't have any other businesses. So, I mean, that's where we're at. So if we're at a pause, we're at a pause, but we can't take a pause and then go, oh, we got to study it again. To me, that's not prudent.
Well, I agree on that one. These studies drive me nuts.
Any specific direction do we want to give to staff?
Can I jump in
Dahl,
1 second, Mayor, members of the commission? It sounds like we may be looking at taking a pause on this. One thing that I would recommend we still do, and this is something staff would do at that point when we feel like downtown is back to whatever the new normal ends up being, is that we do update our utilization counts, and that's something that we can do internally as staff once we get to that point again. I don't, maybe that's next year. I don't know when it is, but I think that piece of data, regardless of what we determine to do in the future, I think will be important to try and keep those numbers up to date. From a staff perspective, I am perfectly okay with taking a pause on downtown parking. I have no issues with that. But I would just note that staff would likely probably try to update those utilization counts at some point in the future, and we can do that internally. So,
Can I ask one more question? Yeah. So, with any potential development, right, we've said, I think on there, one of the recommendations was that, there would never be a parking structure or additional building, right, unless it came with additional development. How much say, if a business came in, in one of these open spots or spots that could be redeveloped, could we say if, they wanted to build whatever, that underneath that you have to have, a public parking garage, or how much say can we put, or pressure on them can we put?
Councilmember Roberts, Mayor, members of the council, we have planted that seed with every single tire kicking developer that we have talked to, any parcel related to downtown, that we want to work with you to try and figure out some way to partner for some additional parking. So that is a seed we are planting with every single individual that we talk to, that we're going to want to try to work with you to enhance parking available downtown if something happens.
Included in here, it looks like they would just have to do the minimum.
Well, again, this is proposed, so this would not be in place until an ordinance change would happen, but what a new development would be working under would be the minimums in our current ordinance, which is whatever those capacity numbers are per use divided by up to 50%. So that would be the minimum that they would be required to include. But again, it would be, depending on what they're asking to do, if it's a conditional use, there may be some conditions that can be included. But I think for the most part, most folks that end up developing in Victoria want to be in Victoria and want to work with the city and the council and the planning commission to be in Victoria. So I think most folks would be interested in having those conversations on how we can best work together to mutually benefit everyone. But Commissioner Black, you're correct. The current ordinance would set the minimum that they'd have to do, assuming they're a permitted by right use downtown.
Yeah, I'm not ready to move forward on that.
Council.
So I just have a question. What Derek was saying, we've done all these studies since 2014. And I don't know what those studies entail, but do we have a list of 3 to 5 things that, no matter how crazy it is, but something that we could start from in terms of these are the options that we should be looking at? I mean, I'm not clear on.
Well, and somebody else can hop in here, but I think one of the biggest differences that we made was to actually sign the parking and tell people where it was. Because we have public parking right here behind the flats, and people didn't know where it was. There's public parking along the street. If you're here for the first time and you're, going to one of the restaurants, they didn't know where it was. So that was one of the first things that they told us to do, and we did take their advice on that and sign the parking. We've built parking along the street. We've got, we changed this to a one-way to make sure that we could get a few more parking spots in. So I think some of that low-hanging fruit we've already kind of knocked off. That's where it is currently. I think until we've got somebody new here that triggers a bigger parking use or a difference in a parking use that really feels like it's going to pinch our current supply even more so. I think to me that would be a point where we would maybe revisit this again. Ms. Hardy, please.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council, Councilmember Hebert. There, as you know, there's been multiple studies, and as the mayor pointed out, there were a number of actions that the city has taken and has put in place a number of changes to address the recommendations that have come out of that study. I can't remember how many kind of takeaways there were in the most recent study, that 2019 one that was published. I think there was something like 10 or 11, and 9 have already been implemented.
Okay, so council, I'm hearing that we're just gonna sit tight for the time being and no action further. Is that consensus? Looking for head nods here, unless there's some action that you would like them to stay.
Yeah, once the pandemic is.
I would just say that we have to have when we're ready to do something, we have to be able to do it. And that it needs to come back up before us. Because the reason that we continually talk about parking is a good reason. We're growing at almost 40%. And it could be faster depending on how well everybody starts to recover from the pandemic. So the reason we continue to talk about parking after we do all these recommendations is because we did add 4,000 people or 3,000 people or whatever the total number was, right?
Yeah.
So it's a good reason, it's a good problem to have, but unless we can find something that actually takes care of a big chunk of parking, knocking a building down downtown or whatever, putting up some kind of large structure, we're not going to solve this problem ever. But there's got to be something. Dana, sorry.
Ms. Hardy.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. I might suggest, I think I'm hearing and seeing consensus, I might suggest that with our annual strategic planning session that we do, that perhaps we just add this to our annual kind of all-day workshop and just do a quick check-in to see if anything has changed and if it warrants any changes from what we've discussed here tonight.
I think that's fair. And to Councilmember Gunderson's point, I think we'd all be in favor of having something we could flip the switch on. If there was some kind of a plan that we could move forward when we felt the time was right, I think that would be one thing that we would be worth exploring, knowing that there's a ton of variables that go into that. If there's somebody that comes along and wants to provide a shared parking solution for us, some of those kinds of things, I think we're interested in maybe exploring something like that we could just flip a switch on and we know we'd get an additional however many parking spaces. Anything additional for direction to the staff from council? Mr. Dahl, Ms. Hardy, we're good?
We're good. My planning commission agenda for next week just got one item lighter.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. All right, our next item for discussion is about future transportation and street funding priorities. Presenting this evening is our city engineer, Kara Gehring, and our finance director, Tricia Pollack. And I think Ms. Gehring's going to start us off. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, we'll give her a minute to get set up.
Alrighty, is that me?
And Ms. Gehring, whenever you are ready, we are ready for you.
I just need to find where Alyssa put it. and I gotta drag it over to here. Perfect. So backwards. All right. Good evening, Mayor, members of the City Council. I had to appreciate Marty referring to you as commissioners, because when I go to the Planning Commission, I keep calling them council members, or I just stare blankly, trying to get my brain to say the correct thing. So the purpose of tonight's workshop agenda is really to talk about the funding that's needed specifically by the City of Victoria for the next 10 plus years as it relates to all these transportation projects we've been talking about, as well as the city's streets, our own streets that we have to maintain and continue to provide funding for. We wanted to provide this background as you start to move through the capital improvement plan and continue working on budgeting. You have some context to what the various lines are that are plugged into Trish's agenda. So I did want to spend a little bit of time and background on how we arrived in the place that we are today. I would say that really kind of dating back for as long as I can remember, but certainly pre-pandemic, we would get pretty frequent phone calls to City Hall with complaints, concerns about congestion and safety on a number of corridors throughout the City of Victoria, specifically Highway 5. Many times I'll get voicemails from people that are stuck in traffic on Highway 5 saying, when are you going to do something about this? But 5 has always been an area of concern, specifically around the intersection of Rolling Acres Road. Rolling Acres Road itself, with the trail crossing and concerns about speeds along the road and the condition of the pavement there. County Road 18 and Bavaria, that intersection, wanting to see it have a traffic light or always stop control or a roundabout. Of course, the extension of County Road 18 over to 41 has been discussed as long as I can remember. And then just other key intersections like 11, 18, and 43 that we now have a traffic signal on. And 5 by Dairy Queen and 5 downtown. Pretty consistently over the last 20 years, those corridors we get calls about. And prior to 2017, really the only answer that I could give to folks was, yep, we know those are a problem, but there's no funding. There's no funding at the state level, there's no funding at the city level. And then they would promptly say, well, why do you keep approving new developments? And that would not be a very productive conversation. But back in 2017, Carver County decided that they really needed to do something different from what they had been doing for the last 20 years, because the problems that I'm describing within Victoria exist throughout the county, where you have these problems really due to growth and no real solution at the state level to solve them. So at the time in 2017, the county adopted the local option sales tax, an excise tax on vehicle purchases, and then increased the wheelage tax to $20 from $10. And in doing so, they had to develop a very specific plan. So this graphic here is their 2018 to 2037 transportation tax implementation plan. And the funds are intended to be used for 26 specific either reconstruction or expansion projects throughout the county. So the funding that's being generated can only be spent on the projects that show up on this plan. And I included in your packet the original press release when that occurred, as well as the resolution that was adopted by the county board. So it's a very precise set of projects. And you certainly can see in looking at the map, a whole lot of them are in the area of the City of Victoria. This next slide here is just zoomed in so you can see them a little bit more closely, but it's essentially a lot of the corridors and intersections that I just talked about as being areas of concern by the community over the past as long as I can remember. The first project within the City of Victoria that used this funding was the traffic signal at 1143 and 18. So that was completed, I want to say in 2020, but I have that pandemic time warp problem where I'm not quite sure what years were what. But then the next piece of the puzzle was the initiation of the Arboretum transportation plan and then the highway 10 corridor study. And, this council, I'm sure, is a lot more familiar with the Arboretum Area Transportation Plan, because I think you all approved that right after you were elected, I think, the majority of you anyway. That study was started in 2019, and it was a $1 million study that the city's share was about $137,000 of that study. The implementation plan and the executive summary I did include in your council packet just as a reminder of background, but really this study is really the first piece of the puzzle for the county in terms of figuring out how we're going to actually go about tackling all of these projects. This graphic is just right out of the project study showing what areas we're talking about. Again, this includes many of the intersections that we routinely receive phone calls about. What I want to draw the council's attention to from the executive summary is really what we're starting to talk about as it relates to the cost of these improvements, as well as the city's share of the improvements that we'll need to be prepared to fund when the time comes along. So these what were considered short-term projects had a estimated cost of $41 million, with the city share being $3.6 million of the 41. The rest of the costs are proposed to come through a combination of grants, which we'll talk a little bit more about, MnDOT, and then the local option sales tax, so the funds generated by the county. And you're seeing a distinction here. They're tracking local option sales tax dollars to be used on trunk highway systems versus county roads. So they are tracking those separately because part of the point in the funding was to bring funding resources to the trunk highway system because MnDOT just wasn't, at a state level, we just weren't going to see any real dollars on a large scale from the state in this area. And then, of course, the other cities involved, Chaska, Chanhassen, and the University of Minnesota. So on each of these slides, you're seeing the same information, but just want to kind of draw your attention to the city share. So again, these what were considered to be midterm projects had a cost of about $88 million. And again, the city's share was $3.1 million. And then the long-term projects, so these are further out in the implementation plan developed in the study. These green projects had a total cost of $77 million, with the city's share being $4 million. I do want to note that these costs are all in build year, so you're talking about these all have inflation built into them, so that's why you're seeing like the city share looking higher as we get into future years because the project costs are higher. So all in all, with the Arboretum Area Transportation Plan, and this graphic was included in the executive summary, and we really are still here. The study's been completed, but we are starting to move towards funding and preliminary design for particular projects. But really the biggest takeaway here is that funding's the key to any of the projects that you saw on that graphic moving forward. So all of those graphics had a $206 million estimated cost. $100 million of it is proposed to come from the local option sales tax funding generated by the county. $78 million in outside grants, so that would be, state competitive pots of money. So as an example, the regional solicitation was pursued for Highway 5, and the county was successful in getting $10 million towards that initial project that's planned for 2025. The county's constantly looking for other grant opportunities to help make these projects become a reality. The $17.1 million in other are those other entities that were listed on the list, whether it be the other cities or the Arboretum or MnDOT itself, and then $10.7 million for Victoria in the projects listed here. So I just wanted to touch on some of the ongoing efforts by Carver County. So their initial estimate for the tax plan was $104 million. Their current estimate is that they're going to expect to generate $160 million in revenue from the local option sales tax and the other tools they put in place. They're continuing to prioritize the state bonding request to accelerate the County Road 18 extension. While it was listed as a midterm project, they do see that as a top priority. So obviously we're not in session right now, but we'll continue to pursue that. And then certainly grant monitoring and solicitation. So I noted on the previous slide that they were successful in getting $10 million for Highway 5 from Minnewaska to the Park Cochia intersection. That does include a pedestrian underpass under Highway 5. So that's planned for 2025. So they'll begin to start moving forward with preliminary design on that initial project in the next year or so. But they're also looking for other opportunities, including federal earmark requests, specifically for 5 from Minnewaska to 41, with the goal that that funding would become a reality in 2025. So that instead of having, every couple years you have a sudden project at Highway 5, which would be really disruptive to the residents, the businesses, the traveling public. They'd like to try to get as much money pulled together in order to do a bigger project in 2025. And really that's kind of the point behind the county initiating that funding is when you have, especially with the Arboretum Area Transportation Plan, you're moving projects much closer to being considered shovel ready, and you have funding to assemble with whatever outside funding you can get. So it starts to make state bonding requests and earmark requests much more attractive when you can show that you have a plan and you have the other pieces of the funding in order to make the project a reality. So the thing that I really wanted to focus on tonight, though, was, the county is going to continue to pursue that for those projects, but the reality of it is that the city needs to be ready with our funding as well to meet the demand. I'm sure you can all appreciate how problematic it would be if the county and the state bring all this money to the table and we're saying, oh, we don't have our $3 million because we didn't plan or budget for it. So we need to spend time now focused on financial planning for how we're going to come up with the money that we need for all of these corridors. So certainly the Arboretum Area Transportation Plan I covered in the last few slides, but we've also been talking about Highway 11 and Highway 10 at some point will be in our growth area. So, we've identified $13 million between now and 2040 of really transportation level improvements. So improvements that typically would be led by somebody else that will, through cost share policies, need to bring money for the table. In addition to coming up with financial planning, staff will need to continue to be available in the support of refining and developing the implementation plans in more detail. So planning folks and myself participate in frequent meetings on these various topics, but as the projects move forward to reality, we'll still be involved in that. And then certainly council action is needed from time to time, whether we'll be asking the council for resolutions of support of some grant the county might be applying for, and certainly other opportunities to engage with other elected officials, whether it be state senators, our legislatures, people in positions of making decisions about funding outside of the city of Victoria. So while we're focused on all these big transportation improvements, we can't lose sight of maintaining our existing infrastructure. So the city has made significant investment in all of your roads for the last 20 years. The roads shown in green and blue on this graphic, and I apologize that blue is really hard to see with blue in the background. But all of those roads have really been improved in the last 20 years where they were either reconstructed or built new by developers, and that pavement needs to be maintained. So, part of our responsibility in all of these roadways is making sure that they don't fall apart. When we went through years of final assessment hearings where we were assessing folks for pretty hefty road improvements, they they would say, okay, we'll pay this, but you got to follow through on your part of maintaining them so that we don't have to pay this big assessment again in 20 years. So that includes routine crack sealing and seal coating. The more expensive element of it is as the pavement ages, eventually it will need a new surface. So we mill off the wear course, the top layer of asphalt that's there. We typically will do some curb repairs adjacent to the roadway. So if you drive around and you start to see maybe the curb settled in an area and there's water sitting there, we typically try to fix that with a mill and overlay. And then we put a new wearing course over the pavement, so a new top layer of asphalt. And per the city's assessment policy that's in place today, all of those maintenance projects are 100% city funded. So no assessments proposed associated with any of that work. And really all of those green and blue streets are going to need some level of maintenance over the next 20 years. So we've estimated the cost of that to be about $13 million. Interestingly enough, the same $13 million amount, but for totally different reasons compared to what was on my last slide. The city created a long-term street maintenance fund a number of years ago now, understanding the need to commit to doing this maintenance. So the city transfers money into that account, but then also uses that account to fund these improvements. So the current balance is $2 million. I owe an invoice for this year's project, so that'll drop a little bit, I suppose, once we pay for this year's project in full. But the city does intend to continue that annual transfer to fund these improvements. We also are continuing to monitor the pavement condition to make sure that we're doing really the right level of improvement at the right period of time. So we don't want to spend money earlier than we need to, but we don't want to if you don't do the mill and overlay at the right period of time, you can end up having the improvement cost you a lot more money if the road deteriorates too much before you do it. And then, in addition to what we talked about here, there's also ongoing and emerging priorities that this council's familiar with and that come up from time to time that in some cases are programmed into the budget, but that isn't always the case. So I did just want to highlight some of those here for a little background perspective. So the Highway 11 corridor study, which is included in the $13 million, does look at improvements needed to County Road 11 from Marsh Lake Road down to the intersection of 10 and 11. And so this council's aware that we're going to be working towards a project to improve 11 north of the railroad tracks. That is in our budget. And we anticipate funding it through a combination of developer proceeds. So the developers are going to pay for some of that work. And then also using some of our municipal state aid funds that I'll touch on in a little more detail on another slide. But what's interesting is when we were meeting with the county and they were asking, well, when do you think the improvements will need to happen south of the railroad tracks? We said, it's probably going to be a few years out, so let's plug it into 2026. Well, now with all the development happening here on the north side, suddenly on the south side, we're starting to be contacted by developers on the south side. In fact, Marty and I just met with a developer, the same developer who's working on the north side of the Welter property, the Welter's own property on the south side too. So they've been looking at that piece. So, one of his first questions was, well, when will that section of the highway be improved? So, you have to be responsive and somewhat able to adjust your funding strategy as development comes along and prompts you to have to kind of change up the timing. And then just some other things that I'm going to work from left to right here. So some things we've been working on over the last couple of years, crosswalk improvements on County Road 11. This example here on the left is by the church and 82nd Street. The main one that we've been working on over the last couple of years is improvements to County Road 11 at Deer Run and 86th Street. This is estimated in 2018 was a $600,000 upgrade to the road in order to add a median and a crosswalk with like the push buttons, like we have now on Rolling Acres Road. So that is currently proposed to be funded. If the county and the city are able to work through it, it would be funded 50-50 with the county. We do have that plugged into the long-term street maintenance plan for funding. And then another example here is the intersection of 11 and 43, or 11 and Marsh Lake Road. That, when we decided to not proceed with the Marsh Lake Road project as a county improvement, the timing and prediction for when a roundabout would be constructed at that intersection fell back down on the priority list. But there's been an uptick in crashes at that intersection as of late. So, it becomes a potentially emerging priority where suddenly you're seeing conditions changing and you're needing to revisit, okay, where should this actually be in our funding plan for these transportation improvements? And then this last one on the right is just with the Wasserman Park now open. We're starting to get requests for pedestrian connections from the neighborhood to the north over to Wasserman, but that's along a county road. So we can't just go simply in that condition with the way the road is there. It isn't super easy to just go put a trail next to it. So we're talking about with the county about really needing to do a little mini corridor study here to figure out, as this parcel on the west side develops, where do we need to have turn lanes? Where's the best place for the safest crossing along to cross the pedestrians from the west side to the east side, where you have all the curves and everything. So that isn't currently built into any of our budgets, but we're looking at, okay, what would that study cost and what's the right timing for doing that work? So I just wanted to highlight these as, this sort of thing happens and comes up. You've got your plans in place and you're figuring out how to fund things, but you also have to be prepared to be responsive to changing priorities as things come along. So back to this graphic where we're sitting today. I just wanted to highlight some of these things are already worked into the city's long-term financial plan. So this 2025 Rolling Acres Road project from 5 up till Interlochen, the Arboretum Area Transportation Plan estimated that cost to be about $1.8 million. We do have a placeholder in the long-term financial plan associated with that project. Rolling Acres Road is one that's kind of been coming for a long time, so we've been carrying it in the long-term financial plan and kind of pushing it out. But that's now looking likely for 2025, so we're going to have to, be pretty clear on how we're going to pay for that when the time comes. This section of 5 that I noted is funded for 2025. The city's preliminary share is $500,000. That's associated with the pedestrian underpass. That is in the trail fund budget right now. We had plugged that in once we knew that at the end of last year. The Bavaria Trail project, you all know the fate of that. And then there's a couple other ones that are plugged into the long-term street maintenance plan or the long-term financial plan.
Why is it the light at Highway 5 and 11, why is it pushed out to 2026?
So that's where it got placed in the implementation plan for the Arboretum Area Transportation Plan. But the conversations we've had with the county is this really is probably a good opportunity to potentially accelerate something sooner. There's some different types of money that could be pursued for those intersection improvements. It's kind of a lower cost with some pretty potentially high benefit for anybody who drives through that intersection. So the kind of project team that's coordinating all of this is looking at that because we'll want to think through what's the right timing of that relative to the 2025 project. I think my thought is we'd want to do it sooner than later.
Yes.
And so that conversation is happening with the group.
Okay, because that would, if they changed the way that light works, that would really help the flow of traffic. It would be backed up all the way to the church.
Well, and I always note that you have to, when I'm leaving downtown, you have to make eye contact with the person to make sure are they really going straight or are they really turning? And that's not a very effective traffic management technique.
I don't know why it got installed that way to begin with. So, yeah, that one's important.
All right, we don't have enough time here.
Yeah.
Again, so
Trish won't go into detail on these two next graphics here, but we did want to show you that we are starting to plug some of these projects in. So as you start to see these things come forward, you'll see the various projects plugged into the capital improvement plan as well as the long-term street maintenance fund. I will say that we don't have a solution for all of the funding that's needed. We're going to need to continue to work through how we're going to manage that. You don't have a lot of tools in your toolbox for funding these improvements. You have the general tax levy, you have state aid funds that I could spend 15 minutes talking through and I won't. The city gets a portion of gas tax every year that can only be used for very specific purposes. But the state aid funds that you do get, all of the projects that you saw on the transportation improvement graphic, those would all be state aid eligible. So that state aid funding will play a part in funding those improvements. And then, of course, there's bonding, the usual types of bonds that are available to the city. So what Trish and I are going to be doing next is we're going to be meeting with the city's financial consultant to start to really figure out how to model this all through and make sure that we understand what tools are available to the city as we start to figure out how to do all that. And that's it.
Terrific, thank you. Ms. Pollack, do you have anything to add?
Mayor, members of the council.
Come on to the.
She's like,
Mayor, members of the council, I have nothing additional. I'm just here to take questions if you have anything specific.
All right, terrific. So, council, questions for Ms. Gehring, Ms. Pollack?
Are some of our
Councilmember Gunderson.
Are some of our connector roads within the city not on that? So some like Cochia, are we banking on that when it does happen to be completed by a developer and not coming out of any
county
money?
That's correct. The first section of Cochia is going to be improved by Pulte. That work is not likely to happen till next summer because we want to have access for the existing property owners through the development before we go reconstruct the existing street. But our recommendation for then the gap that's left would to have that be completed with development.
So similar connections within the city we're hoping would be completed by developers to make inner city travel a little bit better.
Yeah, some of the things I didn't touch on is like Steiger Lake Lane. That's actually in the city's budget for improving it out to the 13.5 acres. And then we do have the easterly piece that is at some point going to need to be improved. Yeah, some of those things we do have a couple of streets still that need to be reconstructed. That's also programmed in the budget.
So, question for you. So, I think the magic number you shared was 13 million by 2040.
For each. So in a lot of ways, it's 26 million.
26 million by 2040. So we got to come up with a little over $1 million a year to fund these improvements. And we set aside some dollars in the street maintenance plan every year, correct? And those dollars that we are setting aside are spoken for currently because we're using those for street maintenance. Do we have another fund where we are setting money aside to get after some of these future projects?
we started.
Ms. Pollack.
Mayor, members of the council, the long-term street maintenance fund is the only fund that we use for the streets.
Okay.
We do have, like Kara mentioned, some of those streets programmed into our long-term financial plan, and those would be bonded for.
Okay, so we can use bonding, and we can use our tax levy. So I guess one of the things that I would be interested in having staff explore is how do we determine what's the best use? Because from a resident standpoint, these transportation projects, this accessibility to traveling around in the transportation system is really important. And I think most people are agreeable to spending tax dollars on improving transportation. So I think that there's some interest on my part, and I'd be curious to see from my colleagues here, to say how much would we need to tick up our levy to start to make some progress towards saving this money, so we don't have to bond for it all, of course, but then also to talk to our financial folks about what's the best way to do that? Is it better to save it, or because we have such a favorable bond rating, is that a good way to go about it? The other thing that I would add is I would really favor getting really intimate with the state funding and how that works, and how we can do more of what we're doing on 86th Street about requesting some bonding dollars from the state. I do know that the state is going to be awash in cash with the money that's from the federal dollars from the, I can never remember what those monies are called, ARE, the pandemic money from the federal.
We've been calling them ARPA.
ARPA, thank you. I can never remember what the acronym is. But additionally, that the state of Minnesota is predicting at this point about a $3 billion surplus. So I think there's some interest certainly in the part of local governments, and I think Victoria is included in that, in trying to figure out how to capture some of those dollars to make some progress towards these transportation things that cause so much headache for our residents. So those are a couple of things that I would like to understand is how much money should we be thinking about on our levy to start saving to pay down some of this, to pay for some of this. And the other thing is, how does that money balance out with our bonding ability, because we do have favorable rates thanks to our AAA rating. Okay, that's council, other things. Councilmember Gunderson.
I think timelines on here are some of the, funding wise, obviously we do what we can when we can. And aside from any state things, and we've said it, Kara said it, Dana says it, the mayor says it, I've said it 1,000 times, our priority needs to be 82nd Street. Because as we grow, that's going to become a safer alternative than 5. And I'm speaking from personal experience, but on August 26th, there were 3 traffic accidents within an hour, starting with my family, then a city vehicle was destroyed, then another vehicle 20 minutes after that was destroyed. 5 is a nightmare. Okay, and
Is that at 5 and 82nd or 5 and Rolling?
that was between Minnewaska and 41 and Rolling Acres, Bavaria. A high school kid didn't pay attention to the fact that my wife was stopped and rear-ended her and destroyed his car. Same thing happened to the city vehicle, and same thing happened to the vehicle after that. 3 days later, I was going east on 5, turned right. The guy in front of me didn't stop, rear-ended the car in front of him. So that's 4 accidents.
I think we're all in agreement that this needs attention. We just got to figure out.
82nd Street, if we're going to do some of these smaller projects, it doesn't, to me, the minor inconveniences of no roundabout and other things at certain areas, that's not doing anything. Spending $30,000 to do a roundabout, spending $15,000 for putting paint on the street. To me, that's not doing anything because people don't pay attention to those anyway. Actually working on projects that impact it. And now it's a bonding year, and if we are awash, then we need to make a big push as a council to our representatives and those at the state level to say, this is the most important street to our community. We need to do this, and we need your help. we need the $10 million that we asked for last year to bridge the gap between what the county has and what that project's going to be. Because that will not only help us grow, but it'll improve the traffic congestion at certain times of the day. And it'll take our younger drivers off the road, clearly coming to go to high school at Holy Family, and then two-way traffic going to Chan High School, Chaska High School, and our community center for ice time. So,
Agreed. Agreed. Council, other direction for staff on this as we think about funding? I think the study very clearly shows that we've got some need.
Yeah.
Okay? Other thoughts? Staff, anything else from council?
Nothing from me, Mayor.
Terrific. All right, with that, we have no more further items to come before the council in the workshop. So can I have a motion to adjourn the workshop?
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
I have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Workshop adjourned. We'll reconvene for the council meeting in just 2 minutes.